Well, actually, first of all, do we have any bill introductions today? Oh my, nothing? Wow, okay, good deal. Now we'll move right on to a hearing on HCR 5006, and we'll have Mike give us a rundown on that. Thank you, Mike.
Mike Heim with the Revisor Statutes Office. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is a House concurrent resolution that proposes to amend Section 4 of the Bill of Rights of the state of Kansas to provide some additional language. It would add, and such rights include the possession and use of ammunition, firearms, accessories, and firearms components. And a new subsection B, the right to keep and bear arms is a natural and fundamental right. The right shall not be infringed. Any restriction of this right shall be subject to a strict scrutiny standard, which is the highest standard for the courts to review a fundamental right. This section of the Bill of Rights was amended back in 2010 when voters approved a constitutional amendment where the language was added about a person has a right to keep and bear arms for defense of self, family, home, for lawful hunting, and so on. So this was amended 15 years ago. If you got questions, I'll try and answer them.
Committee, any questions? It doesn't look like it. Thank you for that. And starting right in with our proponents, we're going to start off with Attorney General Chris Kobach. Welcome to the committee. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's my honor to be here testifying in favor of this resolution and this potential constitutional amendment. I come here as your Attorney General, but just by way of background, some of you may know that before I was your Secretary of State, I taught constitutional law at UMKC Law School for 15 years, and that included teaching the Second Amendment and the relevant case law. When I was in private practice, I represented gun owners in cases involving gun rights. And as your Attorney General, I have been litigating a case which is currently in front of the 10th Circuit challenging a Biden administration rule that, without getting too far into the weeds, the rule essentially attempted to redefine what it is to be engaged in the business of selling firearms in a way that would mean that one person selling a gun to another person, friends, even extended family members, could potentially be a criminal if they didn't first obtain an FFL license from the federal government. And that is a twisting of federal law. If you have questions about it, I'll answer them. But that case is pending in the 10th Circuit. So I've argued the Second Amendment issues and other statutory issues governing gun rights for some time now. So hopefully I can answer any questions you might have. I think the amendment's pretty straightforward. My view is that the amendment is a wise one to add to the Constitution because those of us who cherish the right to keep and bear arms and use them for sporting and hunting purposes have to be vigilant because, as we all know, whenever there is a crime committed by a violent individual against others, oftentimes officials, whether they be federal or state or local, sometimes overreact and attempt to restrict the gun rights of law-abiding citizens. While the current administration in Washington, D.C. is likely to, I think, rescind some of the rules that were promulgated by the ATF during the last 4 years, that has not happened yet, and there's always the possibility that a future administration will again attempt to push the envelope. It was mentioned by the reviser that the previous language was added in 2010, or the existing language of Section 4 was added in 2010. I would note that when that language was added, if memory serves, I believe it was 88.2% in favor. Check me on that, but that number sticks in my head because that is one of the highest, well, it is the highest majority any state has ever registered in voting on a gun rights-related amendment, more than and I believe, if my memory serves, West Virginia comes in second place at 83.4% for their relevant language. So it is certainly a popular issue with Kansans, and my guess is that this language would probably also succeed. I don't know if it would hit that massive 88.2% mark, but it would, I think, succeed. I want to give you just a few quick legal principles on this. It is possible for a state constitution to go beyond the protections of the federal Constitution. So, for example, if the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, goes this high in terms of the things that the conduct that it protects against government infringement, it is possible for a state constitution to go higher. The federal Constitution doesn't limit what a state constitution can do. However, a state constitution can be trumped by federal statute. So Congress can pass a statute that violates or that is contrary to our state constitutional language. That's part of the supremacy clause of Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. So it would not stop a federal statute. The gray area is, what if there was a federal regulatory agency that did not have clear backing from Congress in the statutory language, and a federal agency like ATF attempted to take an individual enforcement action or do something beyond the clear four corners of its statutory federal statute and do something to restrict the rights of Kansas gun owners. That's where this amendment would potentially come into play, and as your Attorney General, I would certainly use it if it were something that needed to be pushed back against to defend the rights of Kansas gun owners. It's hard to get into a hypothetical, but I just raised the point to say that this would not stop a federal statute. It potentially could stop a federal regulatory action, and it would certainly prevent a future Kansas legislature from doing something contrary to the words of this amendment. It would also be applicable in the case of, for example, an individual law enforcement agent who took an action on his own volition that violated the terms of this constitutional right. So we're talking about regulatory future, restricting the scope of future Kansas statutory actions, future Kansas regulatory actions, and future Kansas actions by individual officers that would violate these rights. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions, and I stand in favor of this amendment.
Committee, any questions? Representative Clayton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I honestly thought of asking the reviser this question, but since I have the literal AG in front of me, it seemed apropos. So one of the things that this bill is doing is that it's establishing, so I mean, if you look at line 19, oh, sorry, not 19, but note 24. So the right to keep and bear arms is a natural and fundamental right. Could you talk a little bit more about they already have that right. What is the difference between just a regular right and a natural right?
So a natural right is, the definition of it in legal parlance is a right that pre-exists government, a God-given right, or if one doesn't believe in God, then a right that is of the very essence of human logic and human nature. But it's a right that government doesn't create, whereas the opposite would be a right created by government. Fundamental is a word that is used frequently in cases involving gun rights, and that is fundamental rights are deemed the rights that are given the highest protection. So for a while in the U.S. Litigation over what the Second Amendment means, until the Heller case in 2008, many inferior federal courts believed that the Second Amendment was not a fundamental right and was not an individual right. So that word fundamental has a lot of significance, and the Kansas Supreme Court has also created a distinction between fundamental rights and lesser rights.
Is that so would this be the only right that we would be putting in place in our Kansas Constitution that would have that high of a degree? Are there others,
no,
like the right to vote?
The Kansas Supreme Court has recognized a number of others as fundamental rights, even though the Constitution doesn't use the word fundamental. My assumption is that the drafters of this amendment said, well, we're going to just make that decision before the Kansas Supreme Court makes it, and we will elevate it automatically.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
Committee, any other questions? Representative Sanders?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think the obvious question is, why is this necessary?
Well, I think the answer is, oftentimes a constitutional provision is put into place because the supermajority of two-thirds of the legislature and a majority of the Kansas voters view that this is something we should elevate to a higher law, constitutional law, in the event that down the road someone decides to either introduce a statute or take an action that would infringe it. And that's often the question with constitutional rights. Many of the framers of the U.S. Constitution might have wondered when the Bill of Rights was proposed by the first Congress in 1789, is it really necessary? We're not going to see. And the argument was made, it's highly unlikely that these things are going to happen. But the framers wisely said, well, we've seen them happen in the past with British rule. We've seen them happen in other countries, and so we're going to enshrine them as a higher level of law in the event that something might happen. So, looking specifically at this does deal with accessories. Firearms accessories are constantly being innovated, and new ones are introduced. So you can think of lots of accessories that have become more widely available in recent years, like suppressors. I can imagine a hypothetical in which another one is thermal scopes. I can imagine someone, coming up with a scenario where a legislature or some law enforcement officer without authority decides to seize one of those types of accessories. So, yeah, we don't know exactly what's coming down the road 20 years, 30 years from now, but we do know that there is a pattern of when there is innovation in firearms or firearms accessories, sometimes there will be a reaction, and that reaction will be an excessive one that infringes on the rights of gun owners.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Corbin?
Thank you, Chairman. Kind of falling off of the last question, this would kind of make it so that every city and town and whatever in Kansas would be under the same jurisdiction. Like one town would say no ammunition, one town would say something else. This way, this would be a level playing field for the entire state.
Yeah, it would set a standard that cities and counties and inferior, those are all creations of the Kansas legislature, by the way. The state creates these local units of government, and there is always the possibility that local units of government might try to impose a restriction. And this would effectively say, you can't do that without a specific preemption law passed by the legislature. You guys often will pass a law preempting city and county legislation on some topic. This would make that unnecessary because you'd have a constitutional protection.
Representative Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, sir. I have a quick question about how this legislation would impact ghost guns, 3D printed parts, and things of that nature without serial numbers or traceable. Can you tell us how that might affect these?
Well, right now, ATF, the federal agency, is promulgating, has been taking actions that have tried to restrict ghost guns. In this case, and that, of course, has been litigated in the U.S. courts. My guess is that Congress will probably, who knows, they may or may not be able to muster the majorities necessary, will probably regulate something of that nature because it's of such a high profile. But in this particular case, I don't think the amendments, ammunition, accessories, and components would affect the debate surrounding ghost guns, because ghost guns are about the firearm itself, being assembled by the buyer and not having a serial number. And so I think it wouldn't really, this particular added language would not affect as I'm thinking of hypotheticals, I don't see how a ghost gun regulation or action would be affected by this.
Thank you for that clarification. My concern was that this would unintentionally provide protections for things like that. So it's your understanding that it does not protect or...
Well, yes, 19 and 20, the language on lines 19 and 20 doesn't. Now, the language on 24, 25, and 26, that applies to all aspects of this right in Section 4 of our Bill of Rights. So hypothetically, if there were a case in Kansas that involved a challenge to a restriction on ghost guns, it would elevate the judicial standard to the strict scrutiny standard.
Representative Smoy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for being here. I would like for you to explain a little bit more about the strict scrutiny standard. That way everybody kind of understands what we're looking at there.
Yeah, and that's a term of art that I think many members of the public have learned over the years because it's been so important in various U.S. Supreme Court cases. Strict scrutiny means that if a law is challenged or a regulatory action is challenged and held to strict scrutiny, and that's something that is triggered by fundamental rights, by the way. So if there's fundamental rights, both the Kansas Supreme Court and the U.S. courts would say that strict scrutiny applies. First of all, the law is presumed unconstitutional. So you start off with the law being in the presumption against it. In order to defeat that presumption, the defender of the law, whether it be a U.S. Attorney General or, I suppose hypothetically you could have a case where I was defending a law a future legislature passed. But the defender of the law, the government, must show two things. First, a compelling government interest, which is an interest of the highest order. Merely saving money or something like that would not be a compelling government interest. And then the second thing the government has to show for the regulation to survive is that this was the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling government interest. There weren't other ways to achieve that interest that were less restrictive on the rights of the individuals here, gun owners.
Thank you very much.
Committee, any other questions? Oh, Representative Clayton.
Thank you, and I apologize. Thank you for letting me ask a second question here. The representative from Shawnee brought up a question in my mind. So basically, this would be preempting constitutional home rule for cities, right?
Yeah, that is correct. A city, well, I don't know if I would say preempting constitutional home rule in its entirety, but a city with home rule powers would not be able to violate this amendment, if that's what you're asking.
Thank you, yes.
Committee, any other questions? Representative Howell?
Thank you, Chair. Could you talk about the fact that in the state of Kansas, we have already established for many years the fact that the Constitution of the United States preempts the authority of cities and counties when it comes to Second Amendment rights for a long time. We've established that in law many times over.
Right. The Second Amendment, well, this is another thing that happened actually fairly recently in our history. I'm not going to get into a long description of how the U.S. constitutional amendments are incorporated against states and subordinate governments, but one by one they have been incorporated, meaning they're written to, if you read the first 9 amendments to the Constitution, they all refer to Congress. Congress shall not do this, Congress shall not do that. Over time, the U.S. Supreme Court has applied those to restrict what states can do and what cities and counties can do. The Second Amendment was incorporated relatively recently in the McDonald versus Chicago decision, in which the U.S. Supreme Court held that it is a fundamental right, and therefore it applies against state and city and county and all levels of government. So in the wake of the Chicago decision, yes, the Second Amendment has applied against cities, counties, you name it, and states. And so, yes, the Second Amendment already does apply with respect to cities, whether they have home rule powers or don't have home rule powers.
Committee, any other questions? Not seeing any. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you being here today.
My pleasure, and I will try to stick around for a little while, but I may not be able to stay here for the whole hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Tammy Bartles. Welcome to the committee.
You went from super tall to super short. Hello, Chairman Kessler and committee members. Thank you for having me today. My name is Tammy Bartles, and I am a resident of Lawrence, Kansas. I rise today to speak in favor of HCR 5006. I'm here today representing not only myself, but as the Kansas State Director for Women for Gun Rights, a national not-for-profit that helps women learn how to advocate and protect their rights to self-defense. I also serve on the board of the Kansas State Rifle Association as their secretary and their training committee co-chairman. All of those positions are volunteered. I am not getting paid to be here today. In fact, as soon as I am done, I'm going to dip out and go back to work. The right to keep and bear arms should not be a partisan issue. As a certified firearms instructor, I have trained people of all races, religions, ages, personal identities, and political beliefs. Everyone should have the right to protect themselves with the most effective tools available if they so choose. While common sense should prevail, that arms includes the components necessary for those tools to function safely and effectively, that sadly has not been the case. We have seen efforts to place undue limits on our inalienable right to personal protection through excessive restrictions on things like ammunition and magazine capacity in several states across the country. Even if you personally do not support the Constitution and the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, many of your constituents back home do. There are gun owners in every city and county in the state of Kansas. By voting no on this resolution, you are denying the people who reside in your district the opportunity to have a voice on this important issue. When this amendment is put before the people, you, like everyone else, will be able to vote your personal beliefs. But today, you are not here representing yourself. You're here representing the people in your district, including the gun owners and everyone throughout the state. I encourage you to vote yes and allow the citizens of Kansas to decide this issue as opposed to playing partisan politics with my rights and the rights of all Kansans. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Committee, any questions? Actually, I tell you what, we're going to go ahead and run through the list, and we're going to answer questions at the end. We knew that the Attorney General probably had to leave early, so we went ahead and accepted questions right after him, but we're going to wait for the end of the,
Okay.
And then we'll ask questions. Thank you for your testimony. Next up is Richard Condon. That's what I said. Well, welcome to committee.
Thank you. Yeah, the last name is Scottish-Irish. You'll figure that out in about 10 seconds from now. Mr. Chairman, honourable members of the committee, my name is Richard Condon. Despite my accent, I am very much a proud citizen of the United States of America, and I am a proponent of this bill. I'm a resident of Douglas County, Kansas, and I'm a serving and highly decorated law enforcement officer in Johnson County, Kansas. I'm a veteran of Her Majesty's Armed Forces and was deployed to the former Republic of Yugoslavia in the late 90s as part of a stabilization force. Then as a member of British diplomatic security teams, I spent over 3 years in Afghanistan before taking the role of a private security contractor where I applied my trade in Iraq and off the coast of Somalia. I then for 5 years protected Fortune 500 high net worth individuals and their families from targeted violence. No, I'm not James Bond. What I am is a guardian, and I spent 3 decades protecting people who were unable to protect themselves, and I have seen firsthand what happens to a society when its rights are taken away from them. Given some time restrictions, I've broken my testimony here down into 2 categories. The first one is the right of, or the inclusion of the words shall not be infringed, and the second one, I'll just touch briefly on firearm accessories and components. Simply put, the term shall not be infringed is insurmountable and based on the idea that the Second Amendment was intentionally designed to protect an individual right of such importance that it cannot be easily compromised. The interpretation is that any infringement on the right to bear arms is unconstitutional. My research also shows that nearly every state in the United States has the phrase shall not be infringed included in their state constitution when referring to the right to bear arms. Firearms, accessories and components, as Tammy says and the AG says as well, it encompasses a broad spectrum of things that can go in or on a firearm. I'll focus on the first thing that comes to mind for myself, and that's a suppressor. Yes, I said suppressor and not silencer because unlike the movies, it doesn't silence a gunshot. It reduces the decibel level, ensuring the shooter and the people around them have no unnecessary hearing damage. Having personally been involved in an incident in Afghanistan where I was unable to put on my hearing protection prior to an incident where I had to use my rifle, I suffered permanent hearing damage. Suppressors are a game changer and should not be subject to any draconian measures. As an elected body tasked with the protection of the rights of its citizens, I believe your focus should be to move away from marshalling lawful gun enthusiasts and targeting the illegal use of firearms by society's criminal elements. I know for a fact that members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua are here in Kansas. These gang members are known for their vicious and brutal tactics, giving no consideration to our laws or our law enforcement officers. Swift and decisive legal action against criminal firearm possession should be your priority. On that point, as a law enforcement officer, when I pull a car over, my fear is not going home to my son, is from someone illegally carrying a firearm, rather than someone legally exercising their Second Amendment right. One has everything to lose, the other one's done nothing wrong. Also, as a business owner, I go into people's homes and I train them how to respond in the event of a home invasion. 90% of my clients are women who want to know how to protect themselves and their children. Empowering these women is an honor for me, and I know that in a fight or flight situation, proficiency in the use of a firearm can be the difference between life or death. I also encourage the homeowners to use a suppressor on their firearm because of the confined spaces that they will be fighting in. I urge you to vote in favor of this proposition to protect ourselves, our children, and our children's children. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that. And we'll take questions here at the end here. Next up, Mariah Day. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'll keep this brief today. You've heard a lot of great arguments from other conferees, and I won't belabor the point, but I'm here today representing NSSF, the Firearm Industry Trade Association, and our organization would strongly encourage you to support this resolution. The language in HCR 5006, clarifying that the right to bear arms is a natural and fundamental right, is appealing for many reasons. I won't get into all of those. You can read my written testimony to go over those in greater detail. But directing that any restriction imposed on the right to arms under state law must survive the strict scrutiny standard of judicial review is a simple message to the courts. The fundamental right should not be treated with less care than any other fundamental rights, no matter how disfavored it may become among those in power in the future. I just encourage you to support this resolution and would be happy to stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariah. Next up, we have Megan Hilbish. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman, committee members, again, my name is Megan Hilbish. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas State Rifle Association. We are a nonprofit organization that has over 3,000 current members. And besides that, I'm also a certified firearms instructor and a professional competitive shooter. I have represented the United States across Kansas, across the U.S., as well as internationally in the World Championships. I understand the importance of our individual right to bear arms, including the necessary right to purchase and possess firearm-related accessories, ammunition, and components. All of these are essential to being able to exercise our right to keep and bear arms. KSRA, and I sincerely believe that it is a natural and fundamental right, and that this right shall not be infringed, as stated in our Constitution and in this House concurrent resolution. We fully support that any restrictions on such right should be subject to the strict scrutiny standard. I'm sure you all can understand how a firearm works and what is required to make a firearm fire. A person has to pull that trigger, but there also has to be ammunition in said firearm. So without the ability to purchase ammunition or purchase reloading components to be able to reload or to load the firearm, you wouldn't be able to fire that firearm, and it wouldn't be any good in a self-defense scenario, or say the Olympics or the World Championships. Shooting is not just a self-defense way of, or a firearm is a tool that is not just used for self-defense. It is a tool that can do a lot of really neat, impressive things, including the sport side of shooting, like going to the Olympics or the World Championships, or simply young children learning what to do, what they should do if they encounter a firearm. Anyone that may experience a firearm at some point in their life, you know, these different accessories, components, whether you own a firearm or not, the reason this constitutional amendment is important is because it protects our right to be able to purchase those things that are necessary to be able to safely fire firearms. Not just ammunition, but magazines, sights, scopes, suppressors, other firearm-related accessories and components. So on behalf of KSRA, we urge the committee to act swiftly to approve HCR 5006 and to send it to the full legislature for consideration. Thank you for your time and attention to this important matter, and I am glad to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Megan. Committee, we had one more, Travis Couture-Lovelady with NRA, but we're going to move his testimony over into written. Okay, so, but I also want to kind of point your attention to the written. There are now 8 written testimonies in your packet to go over. So that kind of ends our proponent on our oral side. Oh no, we have a written. So we'll go ahead and ask questions if any committee members have a question for any of these people that just testified. Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One housekeeping question. I'm looking in the S drive and I don't see all the testimony. I just see the HCR. Is there another place that it might be located?
It's under your daily agendas, under today's date.
Okay. All right. I'll look there. Thank you very much. As for the proponents, I just have a generalized question. So the Attorney General had mentioned that one of the reasons that you need this constitutional amendment is because there is, we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know what changes might take place that this constitutional amendment might help with. So I want to try to look at the past and try to better understand. Can a proponent help me to understand any law that's been passed out of the Kansas legislature in, say, the last 30 years that you feel has infringed upon the right to bear arms?
Tammy Bartles. So I am not aware of any that have infringed on our rights, but that does not mean that that will not happen in the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
Committee, are there any other questions? Mariah?
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to address the question. While I can't point to a specific measure passed by the legislature here in Kansas, I cover a region of 7 states across the Midwest for NSSF, and we see these bills passed on nearly a daily basis during session in other states. This is an attempt to get ahead of the issue and prepare Kansas for future attacks on our Second Amendment freedoms.
Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Condon, I had a question for you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your service, both here and abroad. And it was my understanding that you have a business of teaching proper firearms safety and other types of services related to that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so one of the issues in reading through your testimonies, and I just would like to give you the opportunity to ask, is one of the issues of concern is obviously when it comes to school shootings. What advice, how does this apply, and how would you teach those that you do teach about the values of and the importance of understanding of guns and firearms in schools and school shootings?
So, excuse me, of the most recent, most high-profile school shootings since Columbine, there's been a clear indication that something was going to happen. For example, the one in Florida, with Nick Cruz, he was actually banned from wearing a backpack on campus for about a year because he had made threats previously. But they let that pass, and that tragically ended in the death of many, many, many kids. School shootings itself, that's a whole new, another aspect of having assets within a school that can tackle that, and then teaching the teachers and the custodians and the kids how to react in the case of a school shooting, the run, hide, fight scenario. I don't see anything within this other than, I mean, that's a different argument. I know some states and counties have done it, probably further south in Texas. I know some schools allow teachers to carry within there. I don't know if that clarifies anything.
Yes, it does. And Mr. Chair, just a follow-up on that, going to your teachings, have you been asked about how do I properly prepare my son or daughter before they go into a school, safety? Has anything come up? Because I found your suggestion of like, you should have a suppressor for hearing. I found that interesting. I'm just curious if that question has come up.
Yes, teaching your kids, I mean, it starts at home. What I do is I have the little orange guns, and I'll run people through dry stuff. They want to introduce their children to it, introducing them into how to safely navigate around, perhaps if they find a firearm on the floor, ensuring that firearms are kept safe at home in a place where they can be accessible to adults or kids who are, you know, sort of mid-teens that have been trained with them, and then going through the process of starting small, 22 caliber down at the range, nice and close, and then pulling it back from there using larger caliber guns, and understanding that having a gun and carrying a gun is tremendously, it's a massive responsibility. So making sure that they understand that, and take them through it, and just taking them to the range and letting them shoot, they kind of realize it's not like the movies, it's not like Fortnite, it's not like Call of Duty, it's something different. So installing the responsibility in children more so is how I approach that.
Representative Corbett.
Question from Mariah Day.
Mr. Chair.
Just to kind of get back on topic, this bill has nothing to do with school shootings or actually firearms. It's just accessories, correct?
It relates to the way the courts would treat a bill passed by this legislature related to firearms, ammunition, accessories, et cetera. That's all it does. It relates to how the courts treat those issues when they come before the courts.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative McNorton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Day, can I get you back up there? Tried to catch you quick. So, we're talking about the right to have ammunition accessories. Can you tell us any other states that may have banned ammunition, centerfire or something? Just let me know if that's happened anywhere else.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, a number of states have banned various types of ammunition. Usually it's limited to a specific type, whether that's lead-based ammunition or certain calibers, that type of thing. There are states, I don't have a list off the top of my head, I could definitely get that together, but there are states that have, multiple states have attempted to do so. A couple states have actively done so, where they limit the types of ammunition that are available. Does that answer the question? Thanks.
Representative Clayton?
Thank you. And thank you for being here, Mr. Day. And you're always very respectful, and I really like that about you. So following up on the previous representative's question, so does this mean that we would be tacitly endorsing or saying it was okay to have like armor-piercing ammunition?
That's a great question.
I don't like that kind. I don't think it's very helpful to law enforcement. So could you clarify?
That's a great question. Yes, and I appreciate the question. Essentially, there may be types of ammunition you don't like. There may be types of ammunition I don't personally prefer. But the issue at stake here is giving voters an opportunity to enshrine in our Constitution, our state Constitution, protections for the Second Amendment, our Second Amendment freedoms as a whole. There may be specific issues that you or I, we may agree on, we may disagree on, but essentially, if we have a constitutionally protected Second Amendment freedom, which is a fundamental right, as discussed by this bill or as this resolution, essentially it would protect those rights by requiring courts to assume that a statute passed by this legislature is unconstitutional until proven otherwise, until a compelling government interest is proven in those cases. So there's still an opportunity, if there is a compelling government interest in a bill becoming a statute going into effect, if the government can prove that and prove that it limits our Second Amendment freedoms in the least restrictive way possible, the bill could still go into effect. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question, Representative?
I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is that if I vote yes on this, I'm potentially voting yes on something that could allow or condone armor-piercing ammunition. Yes?
I would argue no, because this bill doesn't relate to that directly. Essentially what it does is it puts the burden of proof on the government in any case to prove that the government is restricting Second Amendment freedoms in the least restrictive way possible. So essentially it puts the onus on the government to prove that a bill is necessary. It could be a bill related to armor-piercing rounds, like your example. It could be related to a type of magazine. It could be specific accessories. It could be a type of holster that the legislature might try to ban. It could be any number of things. And you or I may think that something is a really bad idea. We may agree on that. But essentially, this puts the onus on the government to prove that it's necessary. Does that make sense? Sorry, it's a complicated question for sure.
Yeah, no, I think I'm picking up what you're putting down here, so thank you.
Thank you, Representative.
Any other questions, buddy? Not seeing any. Thank you, Mariah. So I want to kind of back up here. I missed one of my own notes here, but we also had Chris McNone would like to speak for just a minute. So come on up, Chris.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I'll be very honest. I doubt I can do a better job than our great AG. So he did a tremendous job. So, but good afternoon or good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Chris McGowan. I am an attorney for, among other things, the Kansas State Rifle Association. I'm also a lifetime member of the KSRA and the NRA, and I do practice constitutional law. I'm here today to testify in support of the proposed constitutional amendment. This is a needed change that will protect responsible gun owners in the state for years to come. The Kansas Bill of Rights, Section 4, and the U.S. Bill of Rights in the Second Amendment formulate the basis for all persons to exercise their right of ownership in firearms. In 2008, the Heller decision was a landmark Supreme Court case that established the Second Amendment's rights to protect and bear arms for self-defense. In 2010, that right was incorporated, as the Attorney General noted, through the 14th Amendment and made it applicable to the states. In other words, it is now the law of the land that U.S. citizens do have a right to keep and bear arms as it was intended by the Founding Fathers. In 2016, in Catano versus Massachusetts, the court in a brief opinion declared that arms are within the meaning of the Second Amendment encompass modern arms, including stun guns that did not exist at the time of the founding. In 2022, the Bruin decision held that the protections of the Second Amendment existed beyond the home and announced the standard to be used in assessing Second Amendment challenges at the federal level. When the plain text of the Second Amendment covers the regulated conduct, the Constitution preemptively protects it. To justify regulation of the conduct, the government must demonstrate that a challenged law is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. This is the standard by which federal laws are challenged, and some state laws in federal court. The standard under the Kansas Constitution is a bit more convoluted, and there have been previously various laws enacted and court cases that have had some conflicting outcomes. In other words, the Second Amendment jurisprudence in Kansas is far from settled. The amendment is simple. It would merely enshrine in our Constitution a standard of constitutional review that is applicable to other fundamental constitutional rights, such as the First Amendment or other suspect classes. In other words, it would ensure that any laws that infringe on the fundamental right to own and bear arms are treated the same as other laws that infringe on other fundamental rights. I know that was a little bit of a discussion, and I think the Attorney General did a great job explaining that. I understand there is at times a lot of discussion or concern around this amendment, so there are a few important things to note. First, this would only apply to challenges of law under the state constitution, not the federal constitution, i.e. we're not changing the federal standard, we're just changing the Kansas standard at the state level. And second, this would not infringe on federal laws passed and ultimately upheld. In other words, it would not impede federal enforcement of laws that are deemed to be constitutional. This merely ensures that the right to bear firearms is no longer a second-class amendment, something that certainly Kansas citizens support and have shown that in the past, and would align with the intent of the framers of both the U.S. and Kansas constitutions. We do ask that you support it. There's one other thing I wanted to note. I know there's been some discussion around home rule, and there was a really great question about armor-piercing rounds. Note that this does not prohibit you or municipalities from passing laws. It does not. What it does is it sets a standard of review if you pass those laws or if the municipalities pass those laws. So in other words, it just sets the standard by which all those laws affecting firearms, both at the municipal and state level, are reviewed by the Supreme Court. That's merely what it does. Again, it doesn't prohibit any home rule or anything like that. So I just wanted to make that clear. There were some really good questions about that, but that's, in my opinion, kind of just wanted to clear that up. So just to your point about, for example, armor-piercing rounds, right? It just has to be narrowly tailored for a compelling government interest. I would argue officer safety is a pretty compelling government interest, and if you were to, say, craft a law that said merely armor-piercing bullets and that hypothetical, I would assume that our state Supreme Court would probably say that's a pretty compelling interest and pretty narrowly tailored. So I thought it was a good question. I just wanted to kind of address that quickly as well. So I guess I'll take questions. I don't know if you guys have any.
Yeah, we'll take a few quick questions here for you while you're standing up here. Representative Clayton.
Thank you. And thank you for answering my question. I really appreciate that. I'm looking for co-sponsors for my bill that will ban armor-piercing rounds. So let me know when we're done with committee and we'll talk about that. So I had a question. This is set to go on the ballot on August 4th, 2026. So that's the primary election when we know that we have lower voter turnout. Why would you support moving it to November when we know that we have more people voting, or do you understand what the motivation is behind this, or what are your thoughts on that?
I can't speak to the motivation or the date. What I would say is I know that they drafted the bill and intended to send it to the voters. I think the voters should have an opportunity to weigh in. When that opportunity is not up to me. That's a much higher pay grade. That's your all's decision. So I guess I would just defer to the drafters and the folks that are putting it on the amendment. I mean, obviously I would support it, and I know that in the past, the public has supported gun rights as the Attorney General pointed out, and it's my understanding the polling is fairly reflective of this one way or the other. So I would argue that it doesn't matter whether it's going to be in the primary or it's the general election, but I'll defer to that, to the drafters of the bill. But good question, fair point.
Representative Corbett.
Just to comment on the armor piercing or whatever ammunition you're talking about, you could put an amendment in or something like that. But it's just like marijuana. You could drive to Oklahoma or Missouri or Colorado and get marijuana or the rounds of ammunition you'd like. I mean, it's symbolic. If it makes you feel good, it's great. But you can't stop human actions. Thanks.
I would just say I agree with you. It's one of the great things about federalism, right? I mean, that's the great thing about states' rights is states can choose their own laws and their own regulations. So, for example, I know there's been discussions surrounding whether or not certain bills are passed regarding magazine rounds and things like that. I lived in Colorado for a while. It was a mistake, but you'll do anything for love. My wife's from Colorado, so lived there for some time. And, you know, there they passed several restrictions surrounding firearms. And what it did, it literally chased businesses from the state. I mean, Magpul left the state. It was a significant employer. It caused significant revenue. So I think your point is well taken, and I think it's exactly right. But that's also the beauty of our system, right? We're not one behemoth of a federal government. We're 50 individual states with individual beliefs and individual standards. So to your point, you're right. Like you can ban in one place and go to another place, and that's how it's supposed to work, right? Is it's like fireworks and other, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. Like you said, I mean, there's a literal arm's length of differences between the states, which is how it's designed to be. So I think your point is well taken.
Not seeing any other questions. Thank you for being here today.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify. Thank you very much.
We're going to close this section of the hearing, and we're going to move into opponents, and we have one oral in person, and that would be Nick Reiniger. Help me out there.
It's Reiniger, sir.
Reiniger.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman?
Welcome back to the committee.
That's okay. It happens all the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee for allowing me to speak today. My name is Nick Reiniger from Inman, Kansas, and I oppose this resolution for different sort of reason. HCR 5006 is, in my opinion, a gun control resolution. It would have been before New York State Pistol and Rifle versus Bruin, and it is today after Bruin. I was previously asked if I think anyone should have their Second Amendment right taken away. And I said no. No rights are taken away, they're just denied. And to qualify what I mean by that is no federal statute can do that according to the current Constitution of the United States. It is not an enumerated power. And I submit a state may only deprive liberty for a specific amount of time at the same time as all other liberties are deprived after someone is violent, forceful, or threatening, and they are seized and confined. This is supported by historical application, case law, and the text. People do not sacrifice their rights. On the contrary, government infringes on rights after applying the sword of constitutional punishment. Government doesn't grant rights. It defends the rights given by Almighty God, which is logic and nature. This is your oath and duty, and it is also your oath and duty to punish those who try to violently, forcefully, or threateningly deprive others of their rights. And if it is life that has been taken, then it should be life as punishment. Restraining orders and signs on the wall are not sufficient because if someone wants to walk through a restraining order or commit violence with their hands, a knife, a pipe bomb, or a stolen firearm, another must fortify themselves from those threats to protect their assets, children, lives, and liberties, of which if you must err on the side of liberty. Government must institute proper use of its sword that promotes accountability and swift, certain punishment. Domestic battery, KSA 215014, is a Class B misdemeanor, just like possessing cannabis. Why? Bring back swift and certain first-time minimum mandatory sentences and punish accordingly, instead of symbolically tying the citizens of Kansas to a radiator so they will be safe from harm to self or others. And here's why. With strict scrutiny, there's an element of discretionary judicial review that will inevitably result in security over liberty, and by adding that strict scrutiny standard, you will further muddy up the Kansas constitutional waters, which may allow further infringements. For example, an overreaching state executive branch member may decide that those who haven't had their coffee in the morning are potentially violent criminals when speeding down the freeway in road rage, and therefore should not have access to firearms, and that caffeine should be a controlled substance, and the possession of it should be a crime. Sounds absurd, right? but so does the language in KSA 216301A10, where it says a prohibiting qualifier is one who is both addicted to and a user of a controlled substance. Does that mean one can be addicted to these legal drugs like caffeine and prescribed amphetamines and bear arms? Or what if it was decided to make an insurance billable psychiatric disorder diagnosis like simple anxiety or depression, one that would be a trigger to forcibly violate liberties because it would be a compelling interest of the government to prevent suicide and gun violence. And those with these diagnoses are potentially violent, including suicidal. It does not matter what party is in the majority of the Supreme Court that may this day or that day say life or religion or bearing arms is or is not an infringible right. Because according to the current Constitution of the United States, these are fundamental natural individual rights that shall not be infringed. President Trump signed a proclamation last week in regard to Black History Month, and it is not lost on me the damage that was done because of a lapsed historical moral compass on their behalf. But look, if you will, to the infamous Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, where the majority opinion listed that if Dred Scott was allowed citizenship, it would give him the full liberty of speech, to hold public meetings upon political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever he went. In the final analysis, we see when fear and ignorance prevails, those who don't let a crisis go to waste break down the fabric of our constitutional republic. We have seen that in the Old West with drunken and violent riotous cowboys, gangsters during alcohol prohibition, 9/11, and more recently, the COVID response and its spiritual and or mental health fallout where government grew and got outside the bounds of the Constitution of the United States and made laws not in pursuance thereof and therefore null and void. Thank you, and I will stand for any questions.
Thanks, sir. We have one on WebEx, and then we'll come back to the questions. So I want to point out, we did have one on WebEx, Leanne Barclay. She has been moved to written, so she'll be added to your written ones, but we do have Grace Springer on WebEx. Grace, are you there?
Can you hear me okay?
Just barely. Give us a second. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, there we go. Welcome back, Grace.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can get my camera turned on.
You may start.
Okay, thank you so much. I apologize. My camera doesn't seem to be working. But good afternoon, Chairman Carpenter, committee members, and staff. Thank you for acknowledging my testimony today. My name is Grace Springer, and I am a senior at Olathe East High School. I'm testifying today because HCR 5006 is a dangerous amendment that poses a direct threat to Kansas public safety laws. These laws protect our communities by keeping guns out of the hands of people who I think we all should agree should not have them. March 4th of 2021, my life was forever changed as a student at my school gained access to a firearm, brought it to school, and fired it, resulting in 3 people being injured. No one deserves to live in a place where gun violence is a constant fear. And over these past few years within Kansas, I have watched as gun violence rates have increased significantly. Importantly, the gun death rate in Kansas increased 48% in 2022 compared to 2023, a stark example of how lax gun laws can impact the lives of Kansans. My experience and these trends lead me to emphasize that HCR 5006 will result in higher accessibility to guns. This accessibility will lead to more safety concerns. People shouldn't have to fear going out in public because of this increased accessibility. According to every stat within Kansas, in an average year, 463 people die and 858 people are wounded by guns in Kansas. Kansas now has the 19th highest gun violence rate in the US, which has increased from last year when we ranked 22nd in the nation. In Kansas, 69% of gun violence deaths are suicides and 28% are homicides. We should not be focusing on loosening our gun laws, but rather than passing common sense gun legislation such as secure storage. We've had mention of how the framers have directed themselves in creating the Second Amendment. However, the framers have not known how firearms would evolve and develop over the years, meaning there's increased needs for checks and balances, which Kansas does not currently have. Furthermore, gun violence costs our state $5.7 billion a year. The cost of life and money perpetuating gun violence is astronomical. Specifically, I believe that this bill would allow felons and domestic abusers to have their hands on firearms because of strict scrutiny. In places like Louisiana and Missouri, where these bills have been passed before, we have seen felons be able to sue the federal government for these rights back. And this has significant impacts on our taxpayers, as within places like Missouri that projected a strict scrutiny law, it would have cost them millions of dollars. Within our economic state, we should not have Kansans paying the toll for this. I would encourage you to read the rest of my written testimony and vote no on House Resolution 5006. This concludes my testimony, and I'm open for any questions if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Committee, are there any questions for either one of the conferees? Not seeing any. Grace, thank you for joining us today. Okay, committee, that actually ends that section. I don't see any neutrals, but I would like to point out in your packet, there are quite a few written opponents to this. Actually, there are now 32. So make sure those, if you haven't gone through all of those yet, make sure you get through those. And we probably will work this bill next week, but I'm not sure on the date just yet. We're still waiting on some stuff to come in to get that all scheduled out. So that concludes everything we have today. We are adjourned.